So let's get into what Marxism is so that we can understand it. And the way I find it interesting to do that is to draw a parallel, a historical parallel, to an earlier time when there was another system that produced critics. We call that system slavery, a system in which some people, a minority, were masters, and other people, a majority, were slaves. The slaves did all the work. The slaves were literally the property of the masters who made them do the work. And when the work was done, everything that those slaves produced belonged to the masters, as indeed the slaves themselves did. And then the masters would do what seemed reasonable. They'd give a portion of the food, clothing, and shelter those slaves had produced back to the slaves so they could survive and be slaves tomorrow and next week and next month so that this system could survive. Well, as you might imagine, there were critics of slavery, particularly among the slaves, which shouldn't come as a major surprise. And you might think of the critics of slavery the way in modern times socialists are critics of capitalism. But among these socialists who were critics of capitalism, just as among the critics of slavery, there were disagreements. So, for example, some of the critics of slavery were angry that slaves had particular kinds of suffering imposed on them. Their families were separated. Children were taken from parents. Husbands and wives were separated because they were property and could be sold by their masters pretty much at the master's will. Then there were other people who were horrified that the diets given to the slaves were inadequate, that the clothing and the housing was inadequate. These people were critical of slavery in the sense that they wanted the slaves to be treated better. In the United States, for example, in the whole first half of the 19th century, when slavery was actively criticized, particularly in parts of the United States other than the South, but even in the South too, there were those who wanted an improvement in the conditions of the slaves. They were critics of slavery who wanted improvement. You might parallel them with socialists who think that capitalism needs to improve the conditions of working people, pay them higher wages, give them better benefits, provide them with a pension as they get old, take care of their medical needs through a medical insurance program, improve the conditions of the workers is what socialists say about capitalism, just like improve the conditions of slaves was what critics of slavery had to say. But then in slavery there were people who went much further. For them, the horror of slavery was not merely, and not even primarily, that slaves weren't well treated. For these critics, the problem was slavery itself. One human being, they said, shouldn't be the property of another. For them, the solution to the problems of slavery was called abolition. They called themselves, and were called by others, abolitionists, because their analysis said that the difficulties faced by slaves, the suffering of the slaves, had fundamentally a cause in the nature of the system, the master-slave system, and that the solution for the problem of the slave majority was transition to a new and different system in which one human being could not ever be the property of another. And here comes the parallel with Marxism. Marxism's analysis, starting with Marx himself and developed since, was an analysis that said that the problems of capitalism, wages being too low, inequality being too high, unemployment being a problem that oppresses and frightens and is an ominous presence to almost everyone in a capitalist system. These kinds of problems are not going to be solved by improving the conditions of the workers, because if that's all you do, the Marxists argue, then you're forever worried that the employers, the people who run the system, the capitalist equivalent of the masters inside slavery, will take back whatever improvement you win, and that the solution, therefore, is abolition of capitalism, moving to another system in parallel to how abolition was the final solving of the slavery problem in, for example, the Emancipation Proclamation issued by Abraham Lincoln.